I am Bruno Conte, based on the University of Bologna, as said, and today I'm going to be talking about climate migration in Africa. The main motivation for this paper comes from the high attention by both academic and policy circles on, in general, the general consequences of climate change, but specifically to what could happen to countries like sub-Saharan African countries. There are many reasons for this specific concern. Some of them are, for instance, that these countries are low-income rural economies that still depend heavily on subsistence agriculture, which obviously make them vulnerable to future changes in the climate, economically speaking. But on top of that, these countries are expected to experience very large population increases in the coming decades. And therefore, understanding where this growing population could be geographically reallocated in a future where migration or where agriculture might not be as productive as of nowadays, has been at the center of, say, the policy research agenda. Indeed, the potential migration flows caused by climate change in the region have been recently coined as the Great Climate Migration. And some of these sort of policy studies do highlight how concerning the case of sub-Saharan Africa could be. For instance, some of them that look only on a small selection of countries and think about only internal migration already suggest that climate migration in the region in the coming decades could be in the order of millions of individuals. Based on that, in this paper, what I do is to dig deeper and more carefully into this issue, and I do so by answering these two following research questions. The first one is that I understand how and quantify by how much can climate change as a shock to agriculture lead to migration in sub-Saharan Africa, where migration is going to take place both between and within countries across the continent. On top of that, the second question I'm going to answer is that I'm going to investigate the economic mechanisms behind this climate shock migration relationship. And with that, I'm going to formulate and evaluate the efficiency of some policies that could be put in place in reality. To achieve that, to answer these questions, in practice, what I do in this paper is to combine a rich granular data set that I assemble with a theoretical model that I develop, where in the model, migration is going to be one of the key long-run adjustment mechanisms of the economy to the climate shock. Importantly, this climate shock is going to be modeled, is going to be thought of as an agriculture productivity shock, which is going to be heterogeneous across the space, like different locations potentially differently affected by changes in the climate, but also, and crucially, different across crops. So I'm going to incorporate the idea that crops are different, they can be more or less resilient than one another, and therefore they could be differently affected by the changes in the climate. I'm going to learn how this is expected to take place in reality in the future from data by climatologists and agronomists from FAO. And I'm going to incorporate this concept of climate shock that I described into this multi-sector spatial general equilibrium model that I developed. Intuitively, what I do in the model, like what my model is capable of, is to explain how the geography of the economy, namely the geographical distribution of economic activities, sectoral output, population, and many other outcomes, how these geographical distributions could be reshuffled as a consequence of a climate shock of this sort. And therefore, by using this FAO data inside my model, I learned how the spatial distribution of population in sub-Saharan Africa would look like in the end of the century in a scenario with climate change. Then by comparing this result with another one of a simulation in which I assume that climate change does not take place by then, I identify locations that will have more or less population as a consequence of it. And that's how I pin down where climate migration could take place and how large these migration flows could be. Obviously, there are going to be several economic mechanisms determining and or interacting with these migration responses to climate change. And obviously, I'm going to discuss them when presenting my results, but importantly, they are going to be very much determined by the capacity of the economy to trade goods across locations and of agents to migrate across locations as well. And that is going to motivate some policy experiments that I conduct that will show what policymakers could do so to reverse or attenuate the climate change effects that are estimated for the end of the century, most notably welfare effects. This is what I do, like to answer the questions I'm interested at. And what do I find with it? First, in terms of aggregate results for the entire sub-Saharan Africa, I find that by the end of the century, climate migration flows will be in the order of 4 million individuals, and the associated welfare losses to it of about a 1% reduction in real GDP per capita. So here, every time I refer to welfare, I'm going to be referring to real GDP per capita. I also find I'm going to show that this interaction between migration responses and welfare effects are very complex, connected through the mechanisms in my model. But one thing that determines that and is important is the degree of spatial frictions in the economy. That actually is going to discipline all of the other subsequent exercise results that I find. For instance, in terms of distributional effects, in terms of, for instance, spatial heterogeneity of my results, my framework is an empirical framework, is a spatial. We're going to be thinking about empirical units that are going to be subnational grid cells, like small geographical squares, high resolution squares. And I'm going to find that the bottom and top deciles of the grid cell level population changes to be of about -40 and 40,000 individuals. There are obviously locations that experience a lot of outflows, and some locations experience inflows of individuals, of course. These results can be aggregated up from like the high resolution grid cell to other degrees of aggregations, for instance, country level. And in terms of welfare effects, I find that the bottom and top deciles of the country level changes to be of about -6 and 6%. And some countries experience welfare losses of up to 15% reduction in real GDP per capita. So there are the welfare effects of climate change is very heterogeneous, and this 1% aggregate loss actually hides a very heterogeneous distribution of these effects, and this distribution is very much skewed to the left. So there are many more losers and a few winners that drive these results a bit to the center. And I'm going to, of course, show and discuss them, which are those. But more importantly, I'm also going to highlight which are the economic mechanisms that drive who are kind of the losers and who are the winners from this process. And this is going to be related kind of to heterogeneity of my results, or what is going to illustrate that is the heterogeneity of my results along the main mechanisms, economic mechanisms present in my framework, in my model. There we are going to have producers in each location that are going to decide how much to produce and trade of different agricultural crops and a non-agricultural good. And one mechanism that is important is that I show that for the locations where producers are able to adapt the production choices across the sectors, those locations experience more attenuous climate change effects, not only in terms of population outflows, but also in terms of welfare effects. And that holds in terms of adjustments within the agricultural sector. So in locations where farmers are able to switch the crops they produce towards another sector, but also in terms of in locations where factors of production locally move out of agriculture. So in locations that respond to changes in the climate by structural change. Both of these channels are going to have this sort of attenuating role first. And second, this role is going to be enhanced by the capacity of the economy to trade goods. Namely, I'm going to show that in locations that are better connected to markets, these results are sort of stronger. This channel plays a stronger role. This is going to then inspire a policy experiment that I conduct, which is the last set of results, that in my opinion is the most important of the paper, that I show that policymakers could combine both trade and migration policies so to attenuate or even reverse the welfare losses of climate change on aggregate and distributional terms. Specifically, I'm going to show that if the barriers for international trade and international migration in sub-Saharan Africa were to be reduced to the levels of the European Union, the sub-Saharan African economy will be able to adapt to the changes in the climate by structurally changing, which will make the economy on aggregate less dependent on agricultural goods, and as a consequence, make climate change less of a problem. This, as I said, is the kind of the main takeaway of my paper, because it shows that, and quantitatively also with carefully quantified simulations, that policymakers do have to reduce the vulnerability of subsistence rural economies like sub-Saharan Africa to the future changes in the climate. And that's what I hope to convince you about in the coming slides. But in a nutshell, that's what my paper is and the main takeaways of it. With it, then, my paper, I see its main contributions is twofold here. For the interest of time, I'm going to be super brief. Just wanted to put here on the slide. So we remain registered. The first one is a more direct contribution to this more macro development literature that from different angles show the importance of integration from both reduction of migration barriers and or reduction of trade barriers, so to allow development in low-income economies through eventually the channel of structural change. And my contribution here is to add the fact of that not simply on allowing development, but reducing the vulnerability to the future changes in the climate, and also to allow or to incorporate the spatial interaction of adaptation throughout different locations and how the choices or adaptation in each locations interact with one another through spatial linkages across locations. Therefore, there is this more direct technical second contribution of my paper, which is to this rich and growing set of papers that incorporate climate change into general equilibrium spatial models, where migration is one of the spatial margins of the economy to adapt to the climate shock. And my contribution to this literature, I have other papers, projects into this literature that also contribute to this literature, and to this one in particular is to incorporate three aspects in my framework that are key to understand how climate change could affect rural economies like Sub-Saharan Africa and what policymakers could do about it. And these three aspects are those that I note here. I'm not going to go over the details. Again, for the interest of time, I just wanted to highlight that briefly. After this, then, how I'm going to continue this talk, I'm going to very quickly speak about the data that I combined so to make this project possible, and how especially some of them explains or illustrate how we're going to be thinking about climate change in my framework. Then I'm going to present my framework and explain how then I bring it to the data, how I quantify my model. This is the part that I'm going to go the fastest in this talk for the interest of time, to then be able to devote the most of my time to the counterfactual exercises that the simulations I performed to understand about climate migration Sub-Saharan Africa. In the future, the policy experiment simulating Sub-Saharan Africa as the European Union, and then to conclude it. Very good. So in terms of data, for this project, I collect vast amounts and aggregate vast amounts of spatial data within geographical units, which are grid cells of 1 by 1 degree, like geographical small squares. There are about 2,000 of these cells that cover the entire Sub-Saharan Africa, and excluding North Africa and Somalia because of data availability. And for each of those, I'm going to collect data on GDP and population for different time periods obtained from different data sources, as well as data on the transportation network connecting each of these high-resolution grid cells. This is going to be obtained from extensive, comprehensive geographical data on road networks that is complemented with geographical data from a friction surface. An important sort of empirical data piece of my project is the agricultural data. Here I'm going to devote a few minutes to explain that. I'm going to obtain for each of these grid cells of my empirical sample the potential yields obtained from FAO to produce some specific crop. These potential yields are a hypothetical measure of production that will be attained on average in a certain grid cell if its entire surface were to be devoted to produce this crop. These are sort of hypothetical measures that are produced by these specialists at FAO, like agronomists and climatologists, that calculate it based on sort of natural characteristics of these locations, namely kind of time invariant characteristics related to terrain, elevation, so on and so forth, but also time varying characteristics related to the weather, like first and second moments of rainfall patterns, temperature, humidity, and many others. This data, I'm sure that many people, if someone here in the audience has worked with agriculture, has came across this database at some stage. It's very rich and very much used in economics because it provides this very elegant way of mapping the complex interaction of all of these sort of weather elements like rainfall, temperature, so on and so forth, into one unit that is very intuitive for us on a measure of factor productivity. Then what we can learn using this data for the case of Africa, it's how locations based only on their natural characteristics are more or less suitable to be producing one crop if compared to another. And importantly, because this data is available for different time periods, and the only source of temporal variation in the inputs used to produce these potential yields is precisely the climate inputs that these models use, it allows us to understand how this degree of, say, comparative advantage across space for each crops evolve over time as the climate changes. And this is exactly what is going to allow me to introduce climate change inside my model. And in the next slide, I'm actually going to show that visual. But just to conclude this, what I obtained for each of these 2,000 grid cells of my sample is the potential yields for the 6 main grain crops that are produced and consumed in sub-Saharan Africa for 3 different time periods. The baseline period in the beginning of the century, a period, a generation back in time in 1975, and then the estimates for the future by the end of the century, which then assume a certain evolution of the world climate that here I take the one that is consistent with the representative concentration pathway 8.5, which is the sort of more pessimistic scenario assumed for the future, like the most fuel intense if the economy keeps growing and emissions and productivity growth at the same pace that we've been observing in the past decades. What does this data teaches us about how to think about climate change in my model? I illustrate that with these 2 maps that show the map of Africa and the potential yields of cassava, one of the crops of my sample, across sub-Saharan Africa. And each of the squares in these maps are the grid cells of my empirical sample, and darker colors stand for locations that are more naturally endowed to produce cassava if compared to others. The comparison of the 2, like left and right, shows clearly like the effect of climate change that we expect according to FAO, what is expected in cassava and productivity of cassava. We see that several locations once suitable to produce cassava are not expected to do so anymore. But perhaps surprisingly, some locations in the eastern side of Africa are expected actually to become more productive. In my framework, we're going to interpret that, or how that is going to interact with economic forces of my model from a purely recurring perspective. So just to fix ideas with a silly example, if sub-Saharan Africa were simply producing cassava, the only good in the economy, what would happen is that these locations, for instance, here in Congo, that were producing cassava in 2000 would not be able to produce cassava anymore. And therefore, economic activity and population will just go out of there to someone else, generating then climate migration. But if the changes in the climate are such that the economy can produce another good and still can be produced here, the agents, instead of moving away, could just switch the production towards that crop. And eventually, in the presence of another sector, is not agricultural, sort of non-agricultural sector, which is going to be present in my framework, these areas could switch production out of agriculture towards non-agriculture, quote unquote, structurally changing, and not necessarily people having to migrate away from them. This is kind of the main mechanism that is going to be present in my framework. But of course, what is going to determine comparative advantage and the spatial distribution of population activity, economic activity and population is going to be determined by many more aspects, and not only the sort of natural characteristics that FIO teaches about. This movement from agriculture and non-agriculture is not going to be as smooth, the substitution between the two. Like these locations here in this example I gave in Congo DRC would only be able to switch out of agriculture if they are able to import agricultural goods from other locations, because I'm going to assume that agricultural goods are subsistence, so people need to eat. They cannot switch production and I don't know, eat glasses instead of food. They will need to import food from other locations. But in a nutshell, this is kind of the main mechanism that is going to be present in my framework. What is then this framework that I developed so to incorporate these mechanisms? This is the model that I developed, that is a static, multi-sector spatial general equilibrium model. It contains the main ingredients of this so-called quantitative spatial economics literature, and namely, I'm going to assume agents from the preference side to have love for varieties of different sectors. So they will prefer to consume goods produced. They will prefer to consume a basket of varieties that are produced in different other locations rather than consume all of the varieties of producing one single location. This is going to generate like dispersion forces in the spatial distribution of economic activity. We're going to assume on the production side that production of the goods, part of the production can be traded with other locations, but subject to standard trade frictions. And this is going to generate agglomeration forces, incentives for the economic activity to concentrate in the most productive locations and or the locations that are better connected to the trade networks. Agents are going to be mobile across the space. They are going to be born somewhere else and choose where to go, but subject to frictions. And this is going to generate congestion forces. Not all agents are going to be able to go to the best locations in the economy. And overall, this interaction of agglomeration and dispersion forces is going to yield the spatial distribution of economic activity, like the geography of the economy, which intuitively, it's going to be very Ricardian, as I said. Each location is going to specialize in the sector they are most productive at and trade with one another. And as I also emphasized just now, there's going to be substitution between agriculture and non-agricultural sectors, which is going to be non-homothetic in the sense that agents are not going to be able to switch out of agriculture if not able to consume, import agricultural goods from other locations, because we're going to model agricultural goods, as I said, as a subsistence good. More formally, and here, this is the part I'm going to go a little bit faster in terms of the presentation, just the formalities of the models and to highlight the pieces that are important to understand my counterfactuals. We're going to assume the geography. The economy is going to be composed by n number of locations denoted by I or J, and they're going to be belonging to country C's. And the economy is going to be producing K-1 sectors, K-1 crops, and a kth non-agricultural sector. So there are K sectors in the economy. Each location I is going to be endowed with a sort of fundamental productivity to produce goods of each of those sectors. This is the capital A parameter, and also provide an intrinsic value of utility for agents living in each location I, denoted by the parameter amenity parameter. The economy is going to be initially populated by a mass of workers that inelastically supply the labor, choose where to go, earning wages W. There's going to be destination location, depending where they decide to live. And this decision, like the location choice, is the dimension along which agents are heterogeneous in my framework. Agents are going to like locations with higher amenities and or real wages, but when making this choice, they are also going to draw a preference in idiosyncratic shock, which is going to be drawn from a distribution that is going to have this dispersion parameter theta, that's going to determine how idiosyncratic are the choices of agents, and also a scale parameter that is scaled up by amenities and scaled down by density. So locations, once they start to get too dense, the agents start to dislike these locations. Finally, also when making this location choice, agents have to pay a utility penalty, migration barrier, that denoted by M bar, from location I to destination J. So IJ here, the double subscript always stand for origin and destination, which is proportional to the bilateral distance between these two locations. And eventually, if this location pairs stand for an international choice, these agents have to pay an additional country destination fixed effect, a sort of additional penalty that captures how sort of strict is the destination country towards foreign migrants. We are also going to have mobility of goods across the space, namely produced goods can be traded across locations and very standard, subject to iceberg trade shipping costs. That is also going to take an analogous format of the migration barriers, is also going to be proportional to the distance, and if standing for international trade will be also subject to this additional tariff iceberg trade friction that is going to be constant across the continent. These are kind of the elements that stand for the geography of the economy, and that's going to interact with the economic forces present in my model. And before presenting that, and especially because the quantification, I'm going to go a little bit brief. I just highlight here which are two elements that are important to understand my policy experiment. There are this destination country fixed effects and this tariff parameter that capture respectively how strict are countries towards international migrants and how costly is international trade compared to international trade. These parameters are going to be quantified with respectively international migration and international trade data for sub-Saharan Africa, and therefore is going to capture how these policies, how strict are these policies in the sub-Saharan Africa as of nowadays. And these are exactly the parameters that I'm going to be, quote unquote, playing with in my policy experiments. Like, what if these parameters were to be reduced to the levels present in the European Union? But just closing this parenthesis, in terms of the forces present in my model, here I can go a little bit faster. We're going to have from the supply side that in each location, representative producers like firms and farmers that produce with the CRS linear production function using labor only. On the demand side, we will have a multi-level CS demand structure that are going to have this Armington structure, namely on the lower level, agents decide how much varieties to consume of goods of each sector. Then these are going to generate these sectoral CS composites for each of those sectors. Those are the crops are going to be aggregated on the middle sector that is going to generate an agricultural composite. And the substitution between those is going to be disciplined by this gamma A parameter, how crops are going to be substituted to one another. And then on the upper level, there's going to be this choice of how the consumption basket between crops, agricultural goods, and non-agricultural goods. And in this level, there is going to be preference. There are going to be non-homothetic, in the sense that there are going to be the class standard substitution effect from CS preferences, but I also allow an income effect that can be non-homothetic. That if then this difference between the standard CS and the non-homothetic CS parameters is negative, we're going to have that this good from the case sector, say for instance, agriculture, is a subsistence good, a necessity good, such that if the location becomes poorer, it's going to spend a larger share in agricultural goods. And the opposite is going to be for the case of non-agriculture. And this is what is going to generate the endogenous structure change in the market. The final piece of my framework is the location choice that, as I said, agents, they are going to be born in some location and decide which J location to go, taking into account real wages and amenities in destination locations, but subject to a sort of idiosyncratic preference shock that is also going to be drawn from an extreme value distribution and is going to yield this standard Frechet reduced form for optimal location choices. That the only thing that is important to highlight here is that the dispersion of this preference draws is going to be equivalent, is going to be the migration elasticity of the model, how agents are going, the response of agents are going to be sensitive to changes in real wages in the economy. The equilibrium, the spatial equilibrium of this model is rather simple. It's that the supply equals demand subject to optimal location choice. I'm not going to bother you with this more information about the spatial equilibrium, how to solve it, but instead here I'm just going to highlight how we're going to be thinking of climate change under the hood of my model. Remembering this cassava example I said in the beginning, it is going to be mapped into this fundamental productivity capital A parameter, and climate change is going to be a change into this value, with which then is going to then affect the relative prices, or better, the potential shipping prices of each location to supply goods locally and to other regions. So if we are negatively affected, now it's more costly my goods to be consumed in other regions, which then is going to reduce the demand or the bilateral expenditure shares of the goods I produce in other regions in the economy. And this is what is going to generate the spatial reallocation of production or sector output for each sector. But because price index also depend on TFP, which includes this across the entire economy, this is going to then affect real wages and then the optimal location choices of agents. So these are the two margins that is going to affect the main outcomes in my model. This simple illustration is very It's just in partial equilibrium. Of course, in my counterfactors, everything is going to be solved simultaneously because the model is static. Here, I just wanted to highlight the pieces, the links, climate change, and the maps are shown in the beginning with a specific details. Before moving to the counterfactuals, very quickly, how I connect my model to the data. The goal is to make my model to map into, to mimic the sub-Saharan African economy by the year of 2000. And I do so by, first of all, borrowing several of the preference parameters from the related literature. And for each of these, they are borrowed from studies that are comparable to the rural low-income scenario of sub-Saharan Africa. There are several elements of the geography that I have to quantify. Some of them I collect them from the data. Some of them I use quantitative methods that's very standard in the literature. So to back them out with a sort of simulated method of moments, just to make it brief in terms of technology, in terms of location preferences. But once I quantify them all, I'm able to kind of simulate my model, do any sort of simulation. Of course, the climate change simulations for the future. But before doing that, I just highlight here, do not provide the details. I also do a validation of the model in which with a backcasting exercise. So I use data that I observed for the past, including these agricultural productivities. So to simulate my model back for the year of 1975. And then I compare the spatial distribution of population that my model yields compared to what I observe in the data. And I find that my model predicts very well the changes in population between this generational period using only these changes in agricultural productivities, this parameter here. So it's kind of reassures the capacity of the model to provide reliable results, numbers for the future. The future, namely the climate change experiment. So what are these main counterfactual experiments for climate migration in the future? The idea is to use this quantified geography, the quantified model that I briefly explained before, to solve for the spatial equilibrium for the future. But the counterfactual to learn about climate change effects is actually composed by two different simulations. In both of them, what I'm going to do is that I'm going to assume that the population of sub-Saharan Africa grows for what is expected to be growing by the end of the century. And then I'm going to perform two different simulations. In one of them, I'm going to replace the agricultural productivities, what is expected by the end of the century in a scenario with climate change, like the cassava example in the right, but for all of the other crops in the economy. And then I'm going to make another simulation in which I assume that climate change does not take place. So I'm going to be using all of the agricultural productivities in the baseline scenario. In this second simulation, the economy pretty much is not going to be changed compared to the baseline one. It's only that it's going to grow in size, but in terms of distribution of economic activity, because almost everything is identical, in terms of distributional aspects, nothing is going to change. And comparing these two is really what's going to show the effects of climate change. And like it's like the difference of the two that is going to show like the effects of climate change on aggregate and distribution. What I find, as I said at the beginning, if I just aggregate up all of the population movements, I find that there are about 4 million individuals displaced, welfare losses of about 1% reduction in real GDP per capita. And another result I didn't highlight in the beginning is that I find that non-agricultural employment decreases on aggregate in sub-Saharan Africa. This might be a bit surprising because sometimes people say, okay, there is more people working in agriculture in a scenario of climate change. How is that possible if climate change is a negative shock to agriculture? And there are two mechanisms driving this result. The first one is that because this result is not homogeneously negative everywhere, remembering the east side of Africa being one of the regions that is benefited by climate change. So there is a lot of migration into that region. I'm going to show that. And this region is going to specialize more into agriculture, so that pushes the agricultural employment up. But actually, there is another channel that is even more important than that, is that in several locations that are negatively affected by climate change are not able to import agricultural goods from the locations that are benefited by climate change. And as a consequence, they have to put even more people into agriculture, so to produce a sort of minimum consumption that they need in agriculture. So they remain in a sort of agricultural poverty trap because climate change reduced the MTFP, so they need to put more inputs, more labor into that. How we see that in details, and here I'm going to show that in maps that shows the changes in several outputs. Here we're speaking about population, so climate migration, both on panel A in the country level or panel B in the grid cell level, the high resolution. And blue colors stand for positive values and red colors for negative values. We see, starting from the country maps, that there are most of the outflows of people are from the Sahel region, the desert that is most affected by climate change, as well as Congo DRC that we saw in the beginning, right, is one of the most affected for the case of cassava. And locations that host these immigrants are locations nearby, as well as here in the Western African countries. But what is rich about my framework is that I can also talk to internal migration. Even though there is large outflows, for instance, in Congo, we see there is also a lot of reallocation of population within Congo, people moving out of the very affected locations in the center towards the locations in the south that were in relative terms less affected. In terms of structural change, that I hear the climate change effects in terms of structural change, I show here in terms of the changes in the non-agricultural employment. So blue or positive changes are referred to the locations or countries that structurally change, which factors in relative terms are more allocated out of agriculture, so in non-agriculture. And we see kind of the obvious things, like the countries that the most affected on average, on aggregate, have more people working in non-agriculture. That does not mean that here in Mali, Mauritania, and Senegal, people are producing high tech computers. It's just in relative terms, they have more people out of agriculture. And the countries nearby that in relative terms more productive in agriculture, they experience comparative advantage gain in agriculture. They have more people working in that sector. And the same, and most especially, works for these countries in the eastern side of Africa. Those that are the kind of benefited countries by climate change, they specialize even more into agriculture. So actually these countries here become a sort of, all in relative terms, new agricultural hub of sub-Saharan Africa. Again, as
Bruno,
before,
sorry.
Sure?
You have a bit less than 5 minutes.
No, I do. I'm controlling, but thanks so much for reminding me. Thanks a lot. Again, what panel B shows compared to A is that there is also a lot of heterogeneity within countries. And we see that this degree of sector specialization takes place not only across, but also between countries. And here, just in panel A, I'm going to just show here red values as welfare effects of climate change. That redder colors are locations that experience welfare losses. So we see that most of the sub-Saharan Africa experience welfare losses, and just a few countries experience welfare gains, which kind of drives these distributional effects. On average, on the aggregate result, a bit to 1%. So that's just a few outliers at the expense of several countries experience losses. Very good. This is kind of the overall of my results. There are several things I can discuss, but just here to use the final 2 minutes to discuss like what I do with it to just provide a policy relevant experiment is the following. As we know from migration leaders, especially in this audience, it's easy to highlight that it's an important a driver of development, reducing migration frictions, especially in rural economies. So I do a sort of what if hypothetical simulations that estimate what would be my climate change effects that I estimate if I then also on top of that reduce the migration barriers. And just to give an idea, I find two things. I find that if, for instance, I eliminate completely the bilateral migration barriers in my model, we will have that migration flows would explode to a lot more than 100 million individuals. This is what we see in panel A, like about 100 individuals more in terms of population changes. And what we see is that actually welfare losses become gains. On aggregate, sub-Saharan Africa has a real GDP per capita that's 10% larger with climate change rather than without. And what happens there is simply that in the absence of climate change, a lot of people simply move to the best locations in the economy. But we also see that in terms of like distributional effects, the range of this result across countries widens remarkably if you compare this with the distributional baseline results. So what that illustrates, and with that I conclude, with that illustrates is that just relaxing migration barriers poses a sort of trade-off to the policymaker. It allows to reverse aggregate welfare losses, but increases inequality. Those that are left behind are increasingly worse off. And this is what I tackle with my exercise simulating reducing barriers, both in terms of migration and trades, as the values of the European Union. And I show that if I combine these two policies, the welfare losses are reversed, both on aggregate and distributional terms. So it allows the economy to structurally change, and that also reduces like the range of these welfare effects. This is in a nutshell, like the main result that I said in the paper. I performed some additional experiments that for the interest of time, I'm not going to go over them, and some robustness checks. So to conclude, in this paper, I quantified potential migration responses in sub-Saharan Africa to climate change, combining a rich spatial data set with a simple, tractable, and transparent spatial general equilibrium model that yet generates a lot of rich interactions with economic mechanisms. And I show qualitatively where climate migration could come from, where could they go, but most importantly, the role of trade and migration policies and how they could be powerful mitigating tools for policymakers in low-income rural economies. There are several things that I'm working on right now that I'll be more than happy to discuss after that, but for the interest of time, I will conclude. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Bruno, for the excellent presentation. Now we have Lucas to be the discussant for your paper. Lucas, you will have from 5 to 10 minutes for the discussion.
Hey, everybody else from my side. Let me just quickly make this full screen. Thanks for having me as a discussant to this awesome paper. Bruno, cool paper, cool presentation. And this is a great paper. This is quite complex. Also enjoy reading it, and I learned a lot. It's a NIFO working paper. You said it's under submission somewhere, so good luck with the paper. And you also won the Distinguished CISO Affiliate Award with it, so I think that's pretty much justified as far as I can tell. And I feel like the paper is everything. It has something on offer for everybody. So general equilibrium, spatial model, migration, climate change, you name it, trade, agriculture, productivity. The overlap with my work is slightly on migration. So I do the impact and evaluation of development finance, and therefore bear with me. The comments will not be too heavy on your model, but rather on these pretty awesome policy implications that you name. And here we go. So you examine the effect of climate change on crop yields, in particular in migration in sub-Saharan Africa. And we learned that. I found your kind of abstract takeaway pretty cool on climate change reducing sub-Saharan African real GDP per capita by 1.8%, and displaces 4 million, where you of course then also qualify compared to other studies that this is subject to prevalent migration barriers in trade. I have basically two main things I would briefly like to talk about and then yield the rest of the time to the distinguished audience. Well, first, I think I would like to learn more about the agriculture data and how far climate change actually feeds into this data set. So as I understand, you say it's kind of the gold standard of these kind of crop yield predictions and actual data, and how exactly feeds climate change into these predictions. What does feed in and what actually does not feed into these predictions? And then isn't what we talk about actually, depending on how the answer to this question is, a lower bound where we only measure part of the effects of climate change, whereas we would have like indirect effects, we would have extreme weather events, we have droughts, flooding, I guess these are feeding in. But then what about indirect consequences? Like we talk about diseases, pests, conflict, and so on. And then the second main point I have for you is basically a lot of these what ifs and what we could do and what are the policy implications of this. And I just continue thinking about these. So as we're talking about policy advice, what are the realistic options in there? So I guess we're not going to get rid of all trade barriers and all frictions and so on. So is there like, are there intermediate steps that might be worthwhile looking at? And another point, what would be the optimal number of crops available for people and the optimal number of substitutes for these crops? And in particular, so I always thought about like this Malthusian concept of, you know, we're not going to feed the world at some point, but we can show that we're actually going to feed the world at some point. And what about innovation in your model? So I saw that innovation is in your model. I have not fully grasped the idea that innovation in crop yields and so on actually happens in this model and how this feeds into the yield data. So when we think about kind of like this over-engineering of crops in the developed world and the under-engineering of crops in the developing world, where do we have to do stuff, and where would innovation in crop yields be most efficient? Yeah, that's basically the main comments I have for you. Just very briefly, some minor comments. I also found it surprising, as you said, some other people find it, that actually we see increases in agricultural labor, where we have decreasing crop yields. I found the case of, and I wrote that down, I think I would love to only hear more about, to also hear about more about the DRC. That seems to be such a special case, and it's always sticking out in your maps. So what's happening there, and why is this seem to be the most important country on these maps in your model in terms of effects and outcomes? So I'd like to read more in your paper, but that might be me and my not being too familiar with the context about what actually is different from your numbers to the numbers that the other papers present on these 19 million climate migrants. So you say, you know, basically they ignore trade fictions. Is that everything? Is that how we can explain the full difference? And then maybe you might want to explain a bit more why you exclude the cash crops, and why, you know, I think you write in your paper that you look at external trade, and that's why you exclude them, so that I can fully follow. And then the obvious remarks, and you also mentioned that in your future work. What about other contexts? What about the rest of the world? What about countries outside Sub-Saharan Africa? And then, is there policy advice for policymakers in the developed world? And which kind of policies should be avoided in the local context? Some more additional comments. I've sent you the slides, so let's rather hear more from the audience. Thank you. Cool paper, and good luck.
Thanks very much.
Thank you, Lucas. So I think, Bruno, if you want to reply in 1-2 minutes, and then we can open the discussion for the
yes. So
other
if it is 1-2
participants.
minutes, I'm just going to choose a few points of the great many points that Lucas raised. In particular, two. First one, just to make this very clear, like this DRC thing, that really Congo DRC in the center of Africa really pops up visually in many of the results. And that happens for two reasons. Actually, it's not a sort of kind of outlier driving everything, or if there's something going quote unquote wrong there, quite the contrary. Actually, two things here is that first, because Congo DRC, it's kind of it is in the baseline economy, the poorest country in Sub-Saharan Africa. Every little changes there in relative terms is very big. So that's why kind of welfare effects there, we see, like, I don't know, 50%, but still, like, even in that case, 50% large, it's still like the poorest country in it. So it's really kind of this relative thing that drives visually things in Congo DRC. But also the second thing is that being a very central country across the geography of Sub-Saharan Africa, it is kind of one of the best connected countries, at least in terms of international connections. It's much more connected to everywhere if we compare, for instance, Senegal. And what happens there, that it's cheaper or less costly for agents to move across country, at least based on distance, compared to other countries. And that what it makes, like, visually to pop up so clearly. And but I just wanted to highlight that it's not a sort of country that drives all of the results in terms of aggregate. Actually, what drives everything is actually the eastern side of Africa, because those are the very populated, those that are specialized even more into agriculture and become kind of richer in relative terms. And this is what drives results, like, to the center, especially in terms of welfare. And the second one, just to highlight, because it's one thing to that it must be clear from my results, you raised, I was confused by climate change being a negative shock and yet agricultural employment to increase. I tried to stress that during the presentation, but this is precisely because of this endogenous structural change mechanism that is inside my framework. That because now the economy is less productive, some countries are less productive in agriculture, they have to put more inputs, more labor, so to consume this minimum value of agriculture. They cannot substitute goods towards another sector, non-agriculture, because also trade is very costly, so they cannot import agricultural goods from other countries. And that's what drives this increase in agriculture. I can go over all of the other details, I took note of them, but I will follow the moderators and eventually gather other comments from the audience.
Yes, let's try to gather some questions from the audience. So if someone else wants to ask a question, I can unmute you so you can ask directly to Bruno. So yeah, Felix has the first question. Felix, go on.
I was wondering if climate change could also impact amenities. for example, like temperature becomes so hot that you cannot live in places, or some places are flooded, for example. Like, yeah, when it has other effects than productivity.
Okay, yes, if I get that right, because I couldn't hear you super well, but what you're saying is that the climate change could have other effects rather than this productivity, for instance, amenities, right? Yes, so this is something that, of course, this paper is focusing on one important channel that we know from development. It's an important push factor of migration in development economies, namely productivity shocks to the agriculture. So this is kind of the main channel I'm studying and focusing on. But some experiments that I'm doing, I'm introducing, not endogenously as I have, but exogenously, some sort of damage functions to amenities. So to capture this idea of that eventually some locations, even though they can be more productive, that they can become too hot and then it's not pleasant to live, or if they are coastal regions, they can get flooded and then the same. So this is something that it's going to come in the next version of the model. But again, as a sort of robustness or additional exercise, because the main channel here, it is agriculture productivity shocks and its role as a push factor of migration. But this is a great point. I even put there in the last slide, I just didn't highlight that in time. Thanks, Felix. Does that address your point?
Maybe I can follow up with 1 or 2 questions, if you don't mind. So
Absolutely.
thanks for the presentation.
Great to see you, by the way.
Yeah, the same. In one of your last slides, you showed the 2 policy experiments, which, if I understood correctly, is either you drop migration barriers in Europe and SSA or SSA, right? Yeah, there.
You're referring to this migration
Yes.
friction exercises, right?
To the two, like, basically I'm thinking about the comparison between A and B, or scenario A and B. First of all, does that make sense? And second, could that be interpreted then as basically a huge part of the result being driven by migration to Europe or to non-SSA countries?
No, okay, great. So this is great, because then I really can clarify this, because unfortunately I wasn't able to devote as much time as I can. 2 things here. First, as in these baseline results and everything in this paper so far, we are thinking about Sub-Saharan Africa as a sort of island. There is no rest of the world. So all of migration takes place both within or across countries within Sub-Saharan African countries. Okay, very good. So the rest of the world is coming in the next revision, but the comparison between these 2, A and B, is the following. The first one, A, is, and that actually relates to one comment by Lucas, that it's nice because then I can highlight that also as well, is that these A are sort of the results of artificial counterfactual results, in the sense that what I do is simply to reduce the degree of migration frictions in economy, kind of arbitrarily. The first one is that I remove only this kind of country barriers, this destination country specific thing. And the second one is that I completely remove the bilateral part of the migration cost. So all of the utility penalties disappear. The only congestion forces here, it is from the idiosyncratic characteristics of agents, okay? What is the role of this panel A? It is to show very clearly the sort of how this trade-off between what happens if we reduce migration barriers, that even though there's a lot of migration to the best and most industrialized regions of Sub-Saharan Africa, like South Africa, and on aggregate, we have this increase in aggregate welfare, it increases inequality, because those that are left behind are increasingly worse off. But then one would say, okay, Bruno, and this relates to the comment of Lucas, are those policy experiments realistic or not, blah, blah, blah. These here, and I do the same exercises also for trade frictions, these here are super artificial, right? There's just some kind of artificial thing. So to make a more tangible, realistic contribution, what I do instead, it is to quantify these counter-specific parameters, the distribution of migration barriers, and the level of international trade frictions that are present in the European Union. And so I quantify these numbers for the European Union, and then I perform the same simulations with climate change and without, but using these values for the European Union. So to do that, actually, I need to collect all of the data that I need to quantify the model. But for the European Union, the entire quantification, just quote unquote, just to pin down the value, the distribution for these parameters, so to convey a more sort of a tangible counterfactual experiment. It is not what if we can remove completely migration barriers, because we know that this is realistic, but something that it's at least a little more realistic. It is, what if Sub-Saharan Africa becomes as quote unquote frictionless as the European Union? And these will be the results that we find, and it shows that trade kind of shuts down this trade-off that migration, reducing only the migration policy imposes. Does that address your
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, it was indeed a misunderstanding from my side.
Bruno,
maybe just
okay.
If I can just add a follow-up question, also looking at these numbers, I was wondering whether you have, or whether you could kind of disentangle the effects, like the consequences of the movements from the population composition effects. Because I think you briefly mentioned that part of the strong results that you have, for instance, looking at the no bilateral migration frictions scenario in the part A of the table, is that now that there's no migration frictions, people are much more likely just to move to high earning places. And that's kind of like
almost no migration, but yes. And then there is this structural change effect, right? We see that sectoral composition on aggregate, there's much more people working out of agriculture on aggregate in Sub-Saharan Africa. Right.
Yeah. So my question was like looking, for instance, at the GDP per capita composition. Change. It's due on the one hand because something happens with GDP, but on the other hand also because the denominators will change in all your cells, right? So what I had in mind is whether one could do kind of like the look at the effects by checking a permanent population. So trying to neat out the population, the pure population composition effect in this
So holding population fixed, you mean?
Yeah. Across the two scenarios. So kind of try to disentangle what part of the effect in each cell is due to what happens at the GDP level and what is due to the effect on what happens at the denominator level. In particular, sorry, if you look at the composites, if you then look at, I don't know, the average effect across the continent, that might matter, right?
Well, a little bit here, we already see that, quote unquote, namely that because this distribution widens a lot, so there are just a handful of countries that are increasingly worse off, and then many more other countries are increasingly better off, and many other countries that are worse off. We see that actually it is the increase, I mean, this 9% here, it is just that it's a very large increase in a few selection of countries, most notably Eastern Africa and South Africa. But if we just put the distribution of these two results, like this one and a baseline, we see that this other one has a much larger mass into the left. So there are many more kind of losers, and here just a handful of winners. So it is only these distributional things already kind of illustrated somehow. And that's what kind of, when I saw that, I learned about this sort of trade-off that only migration policy imposes to this hypothetical policymaker.
This is the distribution at the country level or a cell level?
Exactly, country level.
Okay, thanks.
Well, the cell level will be the same. I mean, it's just because country level things are a little bit cleaner because there's a lot of variation also within countries.
Exactly. Thanks.
Thanks to you.
Bruno, so I think I have a couple of questions just before we finish. And so the first one I had is like, how sensible are results to a different climate shock? Because I imagine that you only show us results for one climate shock. So I was wondering, depending on the degree of how large is this shock, how the results change. And the second one is, so in your model, I think you define workers as homogeneous in terms of their skills, more or less. So I was wondering, like, if the composition of the population in countries might affect also how they evolve over time. For instance, you can have some countries where are mainly focused on self-employed and low-skilled employment, while in other countries you could have more complementarities with high skill or workers in the service sector. So I know it's a very complicated model, but I was wondering, like, if we can also say something about the type of populations that these countries have.
No, absolutely. I mean, and it's not is just a technical complication, say, to add, for instance, worker types, right, as either educational level or sectoral that they work. There is other work and similar to mine, for instance, Jose Luis Cruz, that in his job market paper, he introduces these different sectors, and also kind of this migration barriers, not only, or mobility costs, not only across locations, but also across sectors. So then you ask me, bro, so why don't you have this? In your scenario, there's always this trade-off of building the most complex model possible, but then having the data for quantifying it. And for the context of Sub-Saharan Africa, it's very, and at the resolution that I'm working at, it's unfeasible to have sectoral composition across different sectors for all of the grid cells that I have, and most importantly, bilateral location choices. So we need to learn from which grid cell, from workers from each either educational level and or sectoral initial work, how much they transition in other, like the mobility choices. And this is something that it's unfeasible to obtain. I wish I could have it. So this is something I cannot introduce because of data. This is kind of the cheap answer. But also the second answer that does make sense, in my opinion, is that even though I acknowledge, and we all know here, being migration economists, that from migration literature, the education level or even the sector you work are important things that determine migration choice agents. We are here thinking about migration choices across 100-year periods almost. So it's something that, for me, it's not exaggerated to kind of say that these differences in migration by educational types and or sectoral compositions could not play a very long role in terms of migration choices of 100 years if compared to like short-term migration choices. So this is kind of the two things that touch upon this point you raised. And the second thing, just to conclude, it is something that I had here, that of course, in terms of the climate shock, I assume, as I said, I assume that one is the classic like business as usual, very pessimistic in the sense that everything stays as if today. But then I do several other exercises, including one, for instance, that if climate change is not as severe as that, if like the global economy is capable of reducing carbon emissions from 2050 onwards. And I find that this is kind of less severe scenario, so that everything is somehow attenuated in magnitude. So there is less climate migration, welfare losses are smaller, and this is somehow monotonic than my results to the severity of this climate shock. This if we just assume different pessimistic scenarios for the climate shock. And other types of shock is something that was raised by Felix, right? Other types of climate change effects, which is something I'm introducing and is going to be present in the next presentation.